The final shovel of dirt landed on the coffin with a hollow thud. It was the sound of a door closing forever. Elara stood alone, the black dress borrowed and a size too large, as the last of the mourners from Promise Creek turned their backs on her husband Thomas's grave. They offered her looks of pity, the kind reserved for a stray dog or a broken wagon wheel, a problem someone else would have to solve. Her in-laws, the Davies family, did not even offer that. They waited by their buckboard, their faces hard as the winter-frozen ground. Marcus Davies, Thomas's older brother, and now the family patriarch, approached her. He did not look at her face, but at a point somewhere over her shoulder. He held out a folded piece of paper. "This is yours now," he said, his voice flat, devoid of sympathy. "Thomas's share. The family has decided." Her fingers, numb with cold and grief, fumbled with the document. It was a deed. A deed to the quarter section in Stonefall Canyon, a place known to everyone in the valley by another name, Davies Folly. It was a worthless tract of sun-baked rock and cracked earth, notable only for the skeletal ruin of an old stone silo built into the canyon wall by some long-dead, foolish settler. No one had ever made a living there. No one had ever lasted a full season. "The farm," she whispered, her voice a raw scratch. "Thomas and we built that house." "The farm belongs to the Davies family," Marcus stated, as if explaining a simple sum to a child. "You are not a Davies. Not anymore." He pressed a few coins into her palm, the metal cold as his eyes. "This should be enough to see you to the stage depot. Most folks in your position go east." The injustice of it was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She had given 5 years of her life to that farm, her hands chapped and raw from the lye soap in the frost, her back bent over the fields alongside her husband. Now, with him gone, she was nothing, a piece of unwanted furniture to be discarded. The town watched. They saw the cruelty, the cold dismissal, but they said nothing. The Davies were powerful, their roots sunk deep into the valley's soil. Elara was a transplant, an outsider. She looked down at what she had left, the deed to a pile of rocks. $16. The worn dress on her back, her husband's old wool coat, a sturdy pair of boots, and Buster, Thomas's lanky hound, who now pressed against her leg, whining softly as if he understood the finality of the moment. That was all, the sum of her life. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town mercantile, cleared his throat behind her. "Ma'am," he began, his tone laced with a practiced storekeeper's concern. "A word of advice. That deed isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Let me give you $1 for it, for the paper itself. You can add it to your stage fare." For a long moment, Elara stared at the coins in her hand. She could go. She could run from the pity and the scorn, from the ghost of her husband and the coldness of his kin. But something stubborn and hard, a core of iron she didn't know she possessed, refused to bend. She had been pushed, but she would not be broken. She closed her fist around the coins and turned not to the stage depot, but back to Mr. Gable's store. The whispers followed her like burrs on a blanket. Inside, the air smelled of salt pork, kerosene, and dust. She walked past the bolts of calico and the barrels of pickles, her purpose solidifying with every step. "I'll not be selling the deed," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Mr. Gable raised an eyebrow. She laid her money on the counter. "I need an axe head, a good one, a whetstone, 10 pounds of salt, 100 feet of rope, and a small sack of seed potatoes." Mr. Gable stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "Potatoes, ma'am? Nothing grows in Stonefall Canyon but misery." "Nevertheless," she said, "that is what I need. He packed her supplies in silence, the judgment of the entire town weighing on the transaction. When she left the mercantile, a heavy canvas sack over one shoulder and an axe handle in her hand, she did not look back. She turned her face toward the barren hills to the west, toward the place they called a folly. With Buster trotting faithfully at her heels, she began to walk. The town of Promise Creek and the life she had known vanished behind her. She was walking toward her inheritance of dust and stone. The journey to Stonefall Canyon was a penance. The trail dwindled from a wagon track to a game path, then disappeared altogether. The landscape was a study in hostility. Sharp rocks tore at the soles of her boots. Thorny shrubs clawed at her dress. The sun beat down with a merciless intensity, bleaching the color from the sky. For 2 days, she walked, rationing the water from her canteen, sharing her meager crusts of bread with Buster. The silence was immense, broken only by the wind whistling through rock formations and the crunch of her own footsteps. The world had shrunk to the weight of the pack on her shoulders and the next place to put her foot. On the evening of the second day, she saw it. The canyon was a deep, jagged scar in the earth, its walls streaked with red and ochre. And there, built into the north-facing cliff, was the silo. It looked like a broken tooth, a hollow cylinder of stone 30 feet high and perhaps 20 feet across, open to the sky. It was a monument to failure. She slid down the scree slope to the canyon floor, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The ground was just as they'd said, cracked clay and gravel. A few skeletal junipers clung to life on the canyon rim, but here on the floor, nothing grew. The air was still and hot, like the inside of an oven. This was her home. A wave of despair so profound it made her physically sick washed over her. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground. The town was right. Marcus was right. Mr. Gable was right. This was a grave. She had traded a life of servitude for a death of solitude. Buster licked the tears from her face, his warm tongue a small, inadequate comfort against the vastness of her desolation. The sun began to dip below the canyon rim, and the temperature dropped with surprising speed. A cold wind began to snake down the canyon. Shivering, she sought the only shelter available, the stone ruin. She pushed through the crumbling entrance and stepped inside. The wind died instantly. The air within the stone circle was utterly still. More than still, it was different. The brutal heat of the day was gone, replaced by a deep, cellar-like coolness that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. She ran her hand along the interior wall. The stone was rough, expertly fitted by a mason, long since turned to dust. It was cool to the touch, a balm on her sunburnt skin. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she explored the circumference. In the deepest part of the structure, at the very back where the silo was carved directly from the cliff face, her fingers brushed against something unexpected. Dampness. Her heart stuttered. She pressed her palm flat against the rock. It was cool and slick, with a thin film of moisture. She followed the damp patch downward, her breath held tight in her chest. Near the floor, tucked into a crevice, was a small pool of water no bigger than her hand. From the rock above it, a single drop of water gathered, swelled, and fell with a quiet splash. Then another, and another. A seep, a tiny hidden spring weeping life from the heart of the dead rock. It wasn't a river, not even a trickle, but it was constant. It was water. In a land defined by its thirst, it was a miracle. Despair receded, replaced by a fierce, grim resolve. The fools weren't the ones who built this place. The fools were the ones who had abandoned it. This stone shell wasn't a grave, it was a foundation. and upon this foundation she would build her life. The first week was an exercise in pure, brutal labor. Ilara's world shrank to the circle of stone and the ache in her muscles. The silo was filled with years of debris, tumbleweeds, animal nests, sand blown in by the wind. She hauled it all out by the armload, her hands quickly blistering, then bleeding, then forming a tough layer of calloused skin. She worked from the first light of dawn until her body screamed for rest, falling into an exhausted sleep on a bed of pine needles with Buster curled against her back for warmth. Her first priority was a roof. An open silo was a trap for rain and snow, and a poor defense against the cold. The few gnarled junipers on the canyon rim were her only source of timber. Felling the first tree was a clumsy, maddening ordeal. The new axe head, which she'd painstakingly fitted to a seasoned branch, felt alien in her hands. Her swings were inefficient, glancing off the tough wood. Sweat stung her eyes, and her arms felt like lead. But she persisted, driven by a cold fury. When the tree finally groaned and crashed to the ground, she felt a victory more profound than any she had ever known. Getting the logs down into the canyon and then up to the top of the silo wall was a greater challenge. She used the rope, her own body as a counterweight, and sheer, bloody-minded determination. She devised a system of levers and fulcrums, remembering things Thomas had shown her on the farm. She worked slowly, methodically, her mind focused entirely on the physics of weight and balance. Each log she managed to wrestle into place across the top of the silo was a triumph. She laid them close together, then spent days weaving a thick mat of juniper branches and tough grasses to fill the gaps. The final layer was sod, cut from the one patch of viable earth she found high on the rim and hauled down in her skirts. It was a heavy, living roof that would insulate and endure. Next, the interior. She leveled the floor, hauling out bucket after bucket of dirt until she reached a hard-packed clay base. She then painstakingly laid a floor of flat stones, fitting them together like a puzzle. The work was slow, her back a constant burning ache. She built a hearth against the solid rock of the back wall, using clay mixed with sand as mortar for the stones she gathered. She discovered that the original builders had taken advantage of a natural fissure in the cliff face, a thin crack that ran all the way to the top. With careful work, clearing it of debris, it became a perfect hidden chimney that drew smoke up and away. The most critical system was water. The seep was life itself, and she treated it with reverence. She spent a week carefully chipping a channel in the stone below it, guiding the precious flow away from the wall. At the base, she dug a pit into the clay floor, 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide. She lined it with more clay, pounding it with a heavy stone until it was smooth and waterproof, then let it bake hard in the sun before the roof was finished. The drops from the seep began to fill her cistern, a slow, steady accumulation of hope. It was her greatest secret, a treasure hidden in plain sight. As the structure took shape, she began work on her food system. Farming the canyon floor was impossible, so she would farm inside her stone walls. She hauled the best of the soil from the canyon floor, dark earth she found collected in shaded hollows, into the silo, one heavy basket at a time. Against the damp back wall, she built a long, raised garden bed from flat stones. In this dark, cool earth, she planted her seed potatoes and the few wild onion bulbs she had managed to find. It was a garden of the underworld, a place of tubers and roots, sustained by the moisture from the seep and the ambient coolness of the stone. After 2 months of relentless toil, the silo was no longer a ruin. It was a home. A primitive, circular fortress with a solid roof, a stone floor, a hearth that drew beautifully, and a cistern of clean, cold water. She had built a loft for sleeping, a rough-hewn ladder to reach it, and a heavy door from split juniper logs that could be barred from the inside. She was thin and wiry, her skin tanned to leather, but her eyes held a new light. It was the fierce, proprietary glow of a creator. She had made this. It was hers. But she needed more. She needed life, sound, a source of sustenance that didn't come from the ground. She needed animals. Taking her axe and the last of her money, she left Buster to guard her new home and walked the long road back to Promise Creek. Her appearance in town caused a stir. The woman who walked into Mr. Gable's mercantile was not the soft, grieving widow who had left. Her face was lean, her hands were calloused, and she moved with a purpose that was unsettling. The whispers started immediately. She ignored them. She placed her last $8 on the counter. "I need 3 laying hens and a young goat," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "A nanny, if you have one." Mr. Gable's jaw went slack. "A goat? In Stonefall Canyon? What in God's name will it eat?" "It will eat what I provide," Elara said simply. As she was tying the goat's lead to her pack and figuring out how to carry 3 squawking chickens, Marcus Davies appeared. He stood with his hands on his hips, a smirk playing on his lips. He took in her ragged dress, her sun-darkened face, and the pathetic collection of livestock. "Still playing pioneer, Elara?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "I heard you were living in that old rock pile. I trust you'll have a fine feast with these chickens before the first snow buries you." Elara looked him directly in the eye. She felt no anger, only a vast distance. He was a man of the flat, fertile earth, of fences and furrows. He could not comprehend her world of stone and shadow. "The snow won't bury me, Marcus," she said, her voice even. She hoisted the crate of chickens. "And these are not for a feast." The journey back was a comical, exhausting nightmare. The goat was stubborn, and the chickens complained ceaselessly. But when she finally arrived back at her canyon, and Buster greeted her with joyful barks, she felt a profound sense of completeness. She built a small, sturdy pen against the outside of the silo, using the main structure as the back wall, and thick, stacked stones for the other 3. Inside her fortress, the goats bleating and the chickens clucking were the most beautiful sounds in the world. They were the sounds of life. The town's amusement solidified into a permanent narrative. She became the Silo Widow. Her home was Davies' Folly, a name now spoken with a mixture of pity and derision. The story of her buying livestock for a home in a barren canyon became a favorite tale at the mercantile, a cautionary lesson about the foolishness of stubborn women. A trapper named Brant, known for his rugged self-assurance, even made a special trip out to her canyon. He stood at a distance, looked at her stone pen and sod roof, and laughed out loud before turning back to town to report on the sheer absurdity of it all. Elara was aware of their mockery, but it did not touch her. Her world was the silo. The rhythm of her days was governed not by the town clock, but by the needs of her small ecosystem. Each morning she would check the cistern, its water level a constant reassurance. She would milk the goat, the warm, frothing milk a daily luxury. She would feed the chickens, their fat, healthy bodies a promise of eggs. She tended her subterranean garden, marveling at the pale green shoots of the potato plants as they pushed through the dark soil. The great stone silo, which baked in the summer sun, now began to prove its true worth as autumn deepened. It absorbed the faint warmth of the daytime sun and radiated it back through the long, cold nights. Her small fire in the hearth was all she needed to keep the entire space comfortable. The first winter was the true test. A blizzard swept through the high country, burying the landscape in 3 feet of snow. In Promise Creek, families huddled by their fires, feeding them constantly, their wooden houses leaking precious heat from every crack. But in the silo, Ilara was snug and secure. The thick stone walls were impervious to the wind's howl. The sod roof, now covered in a thick blanket of snow, provided even more insulation. She and Buster, the goat, and the chickens were all warm and safe within the stone circle. She had stockpiled enough firewood to last months, and her small stores of potatoes and dried meat were secure. The isolation was absolute. For weeks, she saw no other human soul. She was utterly alone, but for the first time in her life, she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of her own small, functional world. Before the Great Drought, there were smaller tests. A summer flash flood, a rare and violent event, turned the canyon floor into a raging brown river for a few hours. From her doorway, built well above the canyon floor, Ilara watched the torrent sweep away rocks and debris, unfazed. Her home was part of the cliff. The flood could not touch it. Later, a pack of coyotes, drawn by the scent of her animals, spent a night circling the silo, their yips and howls echoing off the canyon walls. But her stone pen was a fortress. They could find no purchase, no way in, and eventually they gave up and moved on. Each challenge overcome was a confirmation. Her systems worked. The town was wrong. The drought did not arrive like a storm, but like a thief. It began quietly. The spring rains were late, then light, then they stopped altogether. The summer that followed was a season of punishment. A relentless white sun beat down from a cloudless sky, day after day. The air was dry and brittle. The hardy grasses on the canyon rim turned yellow, then brown, then crumbled to dust. In Promise Creek, the mood shifted from concern to fear, and then to panic. The creek that gave the town its name shrank from a flowing current to a series of stagnant pools, which then evaporated, leaving behind a cracked, muddy scar. Farmers watched their corn wither on the stalk. The communal wells turned brackish, the water tasting of salt and desperation. People began to ration, their conversations turning brittle and sharp. Marcus Davies, with his sprawling fields and large herds of cattle, was hit the hardest. His land, once the envy of the valley, became a dusty wasteland. His cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like washboards, their lowing a constant, miserable complaint. The town's confidence, its very foundation of promised prosperity, was cracking like the earth beneath their feet. Inside the silo, Ilara watched the world burn. But her world was different. The stone walls kept the interior cool, a refuge from the oppressive heat outside. And the seep, her secret miracle, continued its patient work. Fed by an aquifer deep within the mountain, it was shielded from the surface heat. The flow lessened, the drops coming slower, but they did not stop. Her cistern remained more than half full with cool, clean water. Her small potato patch thrived in the damp shade. Her goat, fed on dried grasses she had harvested the previous year, still gave milk. Her chickens still laid their precious eggs. She was an island of impossible life in a sea of encroaching death. She husbanded her resources with meticulous care, understanding that what she possessed was the most valuable treasure in the entire valley. One afternoon, as the heat shimmered in waves from the canyon floor, Buster began to bark, a low, insistent growl directed at the canyon entrance. Ilara peered out. A small figure was stumbling through the heat, weaving like a drunkard. As it drew closer, she saw it was a boy. He was caked in dust, his clothes ragged, his face a mask of exhaustion. He fell, picked himself up, and staggered forward a few more feet before collapsing in a heap on the hot stones. Ilara rushed out. She turned the boy over, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Thomas, Marcus Davies' 10-year-old son, her nephew. His lips were cracked and blue, his eyes sunken. He was severely dehydrated, on the edge of death. He managed one word a dry rasp. Water. She looked at the boy, the son of the man who had cast her out, who had mocked her, who had left her for dead. A flicker of the old bitterness rose within her. It would be so easy to do nothing, to let the canyon claim him as it was claiming everything else. It would be justice. But then she looked at his small, frail body, and the hard shell around her heart cracked. This was not Marcus. This was a child, and he was dying. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an imperative. She gathered the boy in her arms, he was shockingly light, and carried him into the cool, dark interior of the silo. She laid him on her cot and went to the cistern. She dipped a ladle into the precious, clear water and brought it to his lips. She let him drink slowly, a few drops at a time, until the color began to return to his face. She soaked a rag and wiped the dust from his skin. She fed him a small amount of goat's milk. After an hour, the boy was sleeping, his breathing deep and even. He was safe. Ilara knew his family would be mad with worry. She took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a strip of leather. She wrote 2 words on it. He is safe. She whistled for Buster, tied the leather strip securely to his collar, and pointed back toward the direction of Promise Creek. "Go home, boy," she whispered. "Go find Marcus." The dog seemed to understand. He gave her hand a lick and then took off, a blur of brown fur disappearing into the shimmering heat. Marcus Davies arrived 2 hours later. He was not alone. He came with 2 of his farmhands, and they were all carrying rifles. He saw Buster waiting at the canyon entrance and followed him, his face a thunderous mask of fear and rage. He was ready for a fight, ready for kidnappers or wild animals, ready for anything but what he found. He stormed through the doorway of the silo, his rifle raised, and then stopped dead. The sudden coolness of the air was the first shock. His eyes, accustomed to the blinding glare outside, struggled to adjust to the dim light. What he saw made no sense. He saw his son, sleeping peacefully on a cot. He saw a stone-lined garden bed along one wall, where pale green vines grew from dark, damp earth. He saw chickens clucking softly in a clean, penned-off area. And he saw the cistern, a pool of water so clear he could see the stone bottom. Water. More clean water than he had seen in one place in months. He lowered his rifle, his mouth agape. His gaze traveled up the perfectly fitted stone walls to the solid, timbered roof. He saw the neat hearth, the stacked firewood, the hanging braids of onions, the sacks of preserved goods. This was not the hovel of a madwoman. This was not a folly. It was a fortress. It was an ark. It was a place of impossible order and abundance in the middle of a world that had fallen apart. He looked at Ilara, who stood by the hearth, watching him, her face calm and unreadable. The rage and fear drained out of him, replaced by a wave of staggering, humbling comprehension. He saw the calloused hands that had built this. He saw the fierce intelligence that had devised it. He saw the sheer will that had sustained it. And he saw it all in contrast to his own failure. His fields were dust. His cattle were dying. His family was thirsty. He, the great Marcus Davies, the pillar of the community, had been brought to his knees by the sun. And this woman, this widow he had discarded and mocked, had survived. No, she had thrived. He looked at his son, alive and safe because of her. He looked at the water she had given him. Finally, he looked at Ilara, and his pride shattered. His voice, when it came, was a choked whisper. "We were wrong," he said. The words seemed to tear themselves from his throat. "My God, Ilara, we called you a fool. We laughed at you." He shook his head, a look of profound disbelief on his face. "We were the fools." Ilara did not smile. She did not say, "I told you so." There was no triumph in her eyes, only a deep, quiet weariness. She picked up the ladle from beside the cistern, dipped it full of cool, life-giving water, and held it out to him. "Your son is weak," she said, her voice even and steady. "You are thirsty. Drink." That simple act of grace was more devastating than any rebuke. Marcus took the ladle, his hand trembling, and drank. The water was the taste of his own monumental foolishness and of her unearned mercy. The immediate aftermath was a quiet revolution. Marcus brought his wife and their other child to the silo, not as conquerors, but as refugees. Ilara shared what she had. She gave them water from her cistern, potatoes from her garden, milk from her goat. She did it without ceremony, as a simple matter of fact. People were thirsty, and she had water. It was that simple. The story, carried back by Marcus's farmhands, spread through Promise Creek like a grass fire. At first, there was disbelief, then a grudging curiosity, and finally, a desperate pilgrimage. People started arriving at Stonefall Canyon, not with derision, but with empty buckets and humbled expressions. The trapper, Brant, came, his usual swagger gone, and asked for enough water for his wife and sick child. Mr. Gable from the mercantile arrived, offering to trade anything in his store for a barrel of her water. Ilara helped them all. She rationed her supply carefully, giving each family enough to get by, never taking more payment than a simple thank you. The name Silo Widow was retired. People now spoke of her home with a kind of reverence. They called it the Stone Spring. When the drought finally broke, months later, with a series of long, soaking autumn rains, the lesson had been seared into the community's soul. They had been saved not by their sprawling farms or their conventional wisdom, but by the ingenuity of the woman they had cast out. The experience changed Promise Creek forever. People began to build differently. They started constructing stone cisterns to catch rainwater, digging deeper wells, and incorporating stone into their homes to moderate the temperature. Marcus Davies, a changed and humbled man, led the effort, openly crediting Ilara's methods. He never tried to reclaim the canyon land. He understood it was hers in a way a deed could never capture. Ilara's silo became a landmark, a testament to resilience. Travelers passing through the valley heard the story of the widow who built a home in a worthless canyon and saved a town. Her knowledge became a resource. People would make the journey to her home, not just for help, but for advice. She taught them how to read the landscape, how to find hidden seeps, how to build with stone and clay, how to work with nature instead of fighting against it. She never sought a position of leadership, yet she became the quiet, unshakable center of the community's newfound wisdom. Years later, Ilara stood at the entrance of her silo home. The canyon was no longer barren. Guided by her hand, the community had helped her build a series of small stone dams to catch the seasonal runoff, creating terraces where hardy plants and even a few fruit trees now grew. The seep still flowed, feeding the cistern that was now the heart of a small, thriving ecosystem. Buster, old and gray-muzzled, slept at her feet in the warm afternoon sun. She looked out at the life she had cultivated from stone and silence. She had been given a pile of rocks, and from it she had built not just a shelter, but a sanctuary. Her legacy was not written on a deed or a headstone, but in the greening of the canyon and in the quiet strength of a town that had learned the difference between what is valuable and what is merely priced.